Guy McPherson here, speaking again with Peter Miller. We took a couple of weeks off during the holidays because we had family issues to deal with. And today we're going to talk about Bill Hicks, the stand-up comic from a long time ago, did a skit and he referred to the 12 industrial scum trucks. I'll say trucks instead. The 12 industrial scum trucks who run the world. And he was referring to the people who are really in charge, the people who, for example, give the orders from, say, the big banks to the US government, to the CIA, for example. And the CIA is charged with using all of the intelligence or surveillance bodies in the United States to carry out those orders. And there's plenty of evidence to indicate, for example, that John F. Kennedy was very interested in having the United States print its money, the US Treasury Department print the money, which according to the Constitution is the only way money should be printed. It shouldn't be printed by a private bank called the Federal Reserve, for example. And so we're going to talk at least a little bit today about the secret cabal that runs the world, what Bill Hicks called the 12 industrial scum trucks who run the world. And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that there are people of enormous privilege and enormous power working behind the scenes with respect to almost everything that affects our lives. So first, though, I'd like to have Peter Miller talk a little bit about the free course you're offering. What's the topic and how do people sign up?
Well, I mean, I'm here allying with Guy to talk about these related subjects. My big interest in life is mental health and specifically borderline personality disorder, because it is one of the most common and one of the most challenging, and I have experienced it myself. Um, it's roughly 2 to 6% of the population that experiences this, and if you take that into account and like say like the population of the United States, you're talking about millions of people, right? And or worldwide, you're talking about 100 million, hundreds of million. Like it's a very common issue, and it isn't talked about enough, so that enough awareness can be developed. And there's lots of people trying, people like myself who have experienced it, studied it, worked through it, and so I'm really thankful that Guy is allowing me to share my free course, which is located at freebpdcourse.com, and includes everything I have learned, written, collected, shared, all kinds of other links to other professionals that describe the various aspects of how you can deal with it. So that's the course. And yeah, what it's important to me is the speaking out part and the destigmatizing. So it's like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Guy, but it's like you're trying to destigmatize the reality of the environmental issues, trying to have an openness about it, so that it's not something that has to be something people are scared of talking about or that they think is inappropriate to talk about.
Right.
It's better to have integrity than to play along with what maybe the mainstream wants you to do, which is to kind of have a surface appearance.
It's also better to be prepared, if only intellectually and emotionally, than to be scared. Being scared doesn't help anybody with anything. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of fear being generated out there by journalists and governments. And even more importantly, they're turning away from fear by misrepresenting the facts. And
Mhm.
yes, when you first learn about certain phenomena, you might find it a little terrifying. And that's probably okay. That's a completely human and animal response to certain things that happen, right? We've all
Mhm.
heard of flight or fight, for example, where in response to a terrifying situation, you either take flight, you run away, or you fight. You stand there and fight for it. And there's a lot of things in our daily lives that fall into the same category. They are actually quite terrifying, but
Mhm.
we don't have to give in to that terror. Courage is not running from the fear. Courage is having the fear and still being able to carry on with your life in a meaningful manner. And I think that's what your course is offering at some level as well, right?
Well, I mean, if you don't accept the truth of the situation, so if I was just to pretend like I only had anxiety disorder, right? If I was to say, oh, that's all I have, right? I just have some whatever depression. All I got to do is take a pill. Like that, I would be lying to myself. I wouldn't have the right tools to actually improve my life because I would be barking up the wrong tree, right? Or I would be minimizing the issue. And something tells me like that must be one of the things humans do best is minimize or lie about what's actually going on. And in so doing, in the long run, making your life a lot harder than it would have been if you had just said, okay, this is what it is. This is the truth of the situation. These are the challenges I'm facing. These are the emotional challenges that go with it. And these are the skills that I need to learn and practice so that I can have the best, I can thrive as much as possible. Uh,
You mentioned barking up the wrong tree,
yeah.
and that reminds me the the cynics who preceded the Stoics in ancient Greece. The cynics would actually bark at somebody with whom they disagreed publicly, right? So they would bark like dogs at these people they didn't agree with. You mentioned something about taking the right pill. My spine doctor had me on these pills for about 3 weeks, and he said one of the side effects will be disorientation. Man, did he underplay that? Did he underplay that one? One
Mm.
day, I couldn't stand up.
Oh, wow.
I was going around the house on hands and knees all day because I couldn't stand up and
Wow,
taking
that's
these pills.
awful. That's
So
awful.
fortunately, they didn't fix anything, so I'm off them now as of yesterday.
Mm. Good,
So,
good.
so at least I can stand up now.
That's nice.
You don't realize how important these things are and how much you should appreciate them until they're gone.
Yeah. Like, so I mean, you recognize the importance of doing whatever you can to maintain your health, um, and being true to the facts of life is part of that being healthy, right? And turning away from things, I guess that don't serve you, like that medication, right, is an important piece. So I mean, I guess I like to think that we're turning away from the superficiality. We're turning away from the dishonesty. We're trying to highlight what is happening that is driving this whole thing, so that people can find their way to a place of acceptance. And acceptance can be a hard place to get to, right?
Oh yeah,
People can really be stuck in their should thoughts. It shouldn't be like this. It should be like that. If they only did this, then everything would be okay. But that's not acceptance, right? Like it's not getting to where we're at and what's actually happening. And
that's
like
bargaining.
bargaining, yeah. Like when I was gaining a lot of my practical experience working with people, and I mean literally working with hundreds of people, right? And getting to know them, collecting their histories and seeing the patterns. I mean, it just occurs to me more and more and more that we live in a particular kind of context, a certain kind of socio-cultural context that is largely devoid of good mental health information. So I don't know if it's ever been a priority. I don't know if it ever will. But since we grow up in a world that seems to be primarily focused on how to make money, how to do business, how to compete, how to have status, um, we suffer consequences from that. And it's not just physical and mental health consequences. Like this is part of there's you're talking about the side effects and consequences of living in this context, right? Like, uh,
Absolutely.
it's not like I don't think this is happening by accident. I think you could call it the costs of doing business. The costs of doing business are that there is um, what do you call that? There's there's waste in the atmosphere, right? So that creates a greenhouse effect, and there's
Right.
the and then there's the global dimming. That's a cost of doing business.
Right.
Um, but
So
I think,
let me give a personal example that happened relatively recently. There's a reporter from the Washington Post who sent me an email message, and Shannon Osaka is her name, and she's a public figure, or I wouldn't use her name. She's a journalist for the Washington Post. I don't use people's names if they're not public figures. And she wrote to me and said, "We're about to run a story, and you're mentioned in it." Man, was I ever. And so I thought I'd give you a chance to respond in advance. Well, so I gathered a whole bunch of information, sent it to her within a couple of hours, and by that time, the story had already run.
wow, wow. Oh boy.
And of course, it was a hit piece. And and they said there are people out there who actually believe we're in the midst of irreversible climate change, that this cannot be fixed. People like Guy McPherson who don't know anything, that sort of thing, right?
Mm,
And one of the things I sent was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change agreeing that we're in the midst of irreversible climate change because of an overheated ocean. And they came to that conclusion in September of 2018. And so she's talking to me late last year. Come on,
mhm,
read a little.
mhm.
You know, I'm not a climate scientist. I know about this. Why does Shannon Osaka not know about this?
So yeah, you've been highlighting these things, I think things that people are loath to fully recognize, right? Because if they fully appreciate it, acknowledge it, recognize it, then they have to take a few steps closer to reality. And they don't
And
want to do it.
reality sucks. Reality sucks for a lot of reasons for a lot of people, right?
Mhm,
We don't want to know that there's some, we don't want to know that we're standing on the railroad tracks and there's a train headed right at us. We don't want to
mhm,
know that.
mhm,
Just
mhm.
let me get on with my life.
Or that there is an entity or like a group, aka secret cabal, that could be pulling strings, making decisions. I mean, we've talked about this before, how decisions that powerful people make affect billions of other people, right? And this is what they do. They make decisions, they pull the strings, and then they decide on the costs of what of their business and what
Right.
they're actually going to pay for and what they're not going to pay for. And I think they're not willing to pay for the worst things that they do,
Of
which is
course.
and I mean, if you were to do a brief summary of these costs of doing business from an environmental perspective, what would be the biggest costs?
Well, I already mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, there's a friend I haven't met yet who's the personal assistant to a billionaire. And when he goes someplace in his billionaire jet, as he frequently does, he takes two jets, one that goes ahead of the one he's in, so that if there are any air pockets, the jet he's in can go around those air pockets, around, over, above, whatever, however they do that, right?
Right.
And and these are the kinds of things that you and I can't do, obviously.
Mhm.
I don't even have one jet, much less two. And but here's a billionaire. Every time he flies someplace, which is all the time, he takes two jets. And you're telling me I need to get a car that gives
Right.
better gas mileage.
Right. So they have these massive emissions, I guess either from their toys or from their factories or whatever, right? And we have these minuscule emissions from whatever we do.
Right.
But we're the bad guys right, somehow, right? Or
Right.
they don't need to change the way they live. Everyone else does.
And we hear it every day from the corporate media, from the Washington Post, the New York Times, the big media outlets all over the world, the Associated Press. They're all putting out this idea that the people have to reduce emissions. The people, that's you and me. Nobody ever
Right.
mentions Elon Musk having to reduce his emissions while
Right.
he's flying to outer space.
Or all the products he produces, how much emissions comes from that, right?
Exactly. And
And
that's everything. Yes, and of course he's able to make money off selling those things because at some level we want those things, right? The people are buying them or he wouldn't be making any money. But we need a lot of things to live, at least to live with comfort.
so one of those costs then is like trillions of tons of waste emissions in the atmosphere, right? Like
Oh yeah,
that's one of the costs that they can't do. Like, I don't know if like I've watched one of your recent videos. There's some factory now in the US they can capture 1,000 megatons a year or something. And it's kind of comical, right? Like because they would need to do 100,000 times more to actually even
right,
break even or something, right?
right, right. And yet that's what's in the news. We're fixing it. We got this problem solved.
Right,
Come
right.
on. We do not have this problem solved.
Hmm. Hmm. So the costs, I mean, the costs are tremendous, and they're so tremendous that they can't pay for them, basically. I guess is what I'm trying to say, and that is a point of acceptance I think we need to grasp. Like they did so much damage with their industry and with their ambitions, I guess, right? So much damage collectively over the years that it's impossible to fix it. Is that true?
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely. Even the IPCC has indicated that we're in the midst of the most abrupt event in planetary history, exceeding that of when the interstellar body struck the Yucatan Peninsula and drove the dinosaurs to extinction and a lot of other species. That was a mass extinction event.
mhm,
And we're in the
mhm,
midst of irreversible climate change. I've pointed out more than 60 self-reinforcing feedback loops at guymcpherson.com, any one of which indicates that we're in the midst of irreversible climate change. And finally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change joined the party and indicated that because of an overheated ocean, that we're in the midst of irreversible climate change. And yet, you'll never read in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any mainstream media outlet, the Associated Press, whatever, you'll never read that we're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. Irreversible, that means it can't be fixed, folks. And I point that out, and I'm the bad guy. But I point that out only because I read the peer-reviewed literature, including the IPCC and the peer-reviewed literature that they cite.
mhm, mhm. Yeah. And even if the trajectory and the timelines are hard to establish, it doesn't mean that they are incorrect projections. I mean, it's
Right,
a lot of I mean, and that's where people will try to invalidate you and the things that you share
right,
is by saying, oh, you were off by 4 years, right? So, now you're completely you're not legitimate anymore, right? Like so, which is it's quite irrational. And I can say that, and I'm a being who struggles with being rational at times. But I think it's quite irrational to say, oh, Guy was off by 5 years, so his entire message is false.
right. Well, and in fact, here's a great example. The among the most renowned peer-reviewed journals in the world are the annual review series. There are 51 journals in the annual review series, and the one that focuses on climate change and a lot of other factors is called the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And in the 2012 issue of the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences, there was a paper called The Future of Arctic Sea Ice. It was written by Wisław Maslowski, who's Polish, and three other scholars. And Maslowski works at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. I met with him there and we had a conversation that was recorded. But in their article, The Future of Arctic Sea Ice, they indicated that the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. And so I quoted that a lot, and I know what that means. What that means is the rate of environmental change in the wake of that event will be way too fast for humans and most other organisms to adapt. The environmental
Mhm.
change is just too fast. It's like you're riding in a bus and the air conditioner goes out and you're in Houston in the summertime and you can't roll down the windows and there's no way to fix it. people are going to be uncomfortable.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well,
Hmm.
they were wrong. They projected an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. The last time that was supposed to happen, according to their projection, was 2019. Here we
Hmm.
are,
Yeah.
2024, 5 years later, and we're still alive.
Hmm.
And I was wrong reaching that conclusion because they were wrong. But, and now, by the way, that same research group headed by the same professor, Maslowski, has come up with what they call a 6 month ensemble forecast, which indicates in early April whether there will be an ice-free Arctic Ocean the following late September.
Right.
And so I've been relying heavily on that forecast now and trying to use it to demonstrate to people whether we're going to make it another year or we're not based on that one factor.
And being off by 5 years doesn't change the fact that it is still a heat engine. Civilization is still a heat engine, even if we're off by a few years, right? It's still a heat engine. And all the patterns of the ways people do business, they aren't shifting very much in terms of all the costs of doing business and the waste that doesn't get cleaned up. I mean, if people were actually accountable and had to clean up their mess in the business that they do, would they still do business, right? Like, is that's what I'm wondering. Like, if you actually had
Right,
to be accountable for your
right,
mess, like, like
right,
If Elon Musk or all the others with big factories had to make sure that they cleaned up their emissions or had some carbon capture facility to, I mean, would that offset their profits, right?
right. Absolutely. And this is one of the ways that Western Europe is very different from the United States and Canada. In Western Europe, shortly after World War II, all the countries in the European Union decided that things that were bad for the environment were going to be expensive, and they would tax them heavily, and those taxes would be used to clean up any messes that resulted. We don't do that in the United States. We have an oil spill like Exxon Valdez. Who pays for that? It comes out of the general fund. It
Mm,
comes out of you and me. It comes out of our taxes. The oil companies don't have to pay for that cleanup.
not even a little. Is that
No, of
no?
course not. We wouldn't want them to suffer financially.
I thought that BP company had to clean up some or do something, but
Yes, yes. In the wake of Deepwater Horizon, they did have to do a little bit, but it wasn't anywhere near the whole thing. And that's what
right,
I'm talking about.
right,
Western
right,
Europe, they pay for the whole thing because they
right,
raise the money in advance.
right.
You can't sell batteries. You know, a little 9-volt battery in this country costs $4, and in Europe it's $14. And
Mm,
there's a reason for that. That's because the cost is built in to the price.
okay, yeah,
These batteries cost a lot to get rid of once you're done with them. You
right.
know, when I was living in Tucson, this is so funny. For the first year or two that I was living there, we would take leftover oil. Like I was changing my own oil on the vehicle, and we would take it to the waste treatment plant, and it would be separate from everything else because this is something that's bad. You can't just pour oil on the ground or it gets into the groundwater and causes all kinds of problems, right? Everybody knows
Mm-hmm,
that.
mm-hmm.
So, well, after the first few years, I went and looked for the pile. I couldn't find it, and they said, "Oh, we don't do that anymore. We've realized that it takes 20 years for that oil to get into the water table, so we're just not dealing with it." I'm
Ah,
like, "Wait, 20 years? Oh, and by the way, this was more than 25 years ago."
mm-hmm.
So that oil is getting into the water table
Right,
and
yeah.
nobody cares
I
because
think
it
in
costs money.
Alberta or parts of Canada, there's something similar where they have uncapped wells or something.
Uh-huh.
So they don't pay to do that part. They just kind of abandon the well. And then there's environmental consequences, of course, right? To that. If I'm not mistaken, I guess I could be in error there, but I think there's lots of companies that abandon their wells.
Of course, in the United States, that's just common practice.
This is common practice.
They just walk away
Right, right, right,
because in this country, all the benefits are to the private corporations.
right. Right.
And
So that
all
we
the
can
disadvantages are borne by the civilians.
keep that trickle down effect going. Right.
Exactly.
Can I have a trickle?
I was I was at a presentation many years ago, and somebody in the audience asked about the customers. What kind of effect does this have on customers? And the person who's delivering the presentation said, "That's really interesting. You use that word. Only people in the United States use that word, customer. In other countries, they say civilians.
Oh, okay.
But
Interesting.
here, everything is about consuming. Everything is
Right.
about buying more crap that we don't need."
Right.
So,
Right. And yeah. And so I guess what we're highlighting, and like you emphasize the cost to the planet and to what we can expect in part for what's coming. And I'm arguing for the health of the human and the brain, right?
and
And
they're connected, by the way.
yeah,
They're definitely interconnected. The humans are what we're talking about that's driving this thing and that's benefiting or not from
right.
our actions.
Like I think what I've experienced, and maybe what others could share with their mental health, is like it's almost like you can empathize with Mother Earth. It's like you feel you feel like how you've been impacted by living in this context, right? Like you're a being, and there's consequences that can't be avoided, and some of us are more vulnerable to those consequences or costs of doing business, and it can make life incredibly hard to just manage, right? And so I really think I empathize with Mother Earth and with the way that you talk about Mother Earth and what's happened to her, like, and if you're okay with that way of speaking, um,
Sure.
yeah, like she's being burned alive, neglected, right? She's being shit on, like it's like raped,
Yes.
like right, like I feel
Right.
like that's been part of my experience in ways, like not exactly those same words, but to be hurt in those ways and to experience all the consequences of being hurt in those ways and not even understanding what happened. So I mean, for people just to learn, like this is where we are, this is what's happened, this is why people suffer so much, this is why Earth is suffering so much, and there's these people at the top who could really care less how much we hurt, right? And how awful our lives are, and they're never held accountable.
Right. Right. And they aren't going to give up any privilege, right? They enjoy enormous privileges. I made a short video a while back, something about additional privilege being a one-way street. And I learned that from my dog, of all things. When I moved for a year to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area from Tucson, so I took a leave of absence from my professor position at the University of Arizona, moved to Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and worked for the Nature Conservancy for a year. And in this house, we had a backyard that was fenced. So in the morning, the dog wanted to go out to relieve itself. So I would get out of bed and let the dog out, and then the incoming door, I would hear it when she came back in. It would go bang against the wall, right? And then she'd come in and she'd lay down on her bed, which was beside our bed. And then my brother and sister-in-law stayed at the house for 10 days over the holidays. We were gone. They were there by themselves. I come back and I let the dog out in the morning, and then I hear the door go bang. And so I go out to close the door and I come back into the bedroom, and that dog is on my bed.
Mm.
Wait, that never happened before. So my brother and sister-in-law in 10 days trained my dog to jump up on the bed when she came back in the house.
Yeah. So
And
it is easy to make a context in ways. I think you're saying like to make a new type of environment.
yes, and we do the same thing. Once we get a little bit more privilege, like the first time somebody had a cell phone, everybody needed a cell phone. The first time somebody had a smartphone, everybody needed a smartphone,
Right, right.
right? And so there's no way the dog was coming off the bed. This is just the way we do business now.
And humans can be equally conditioned and trained, right? Depending on the
Yes,
context that they're in.
yes.
And
And
so in our
and so
context, yeah, go
so
ahead.
so I was trained into getting a bigger bed. We had to get a bigger bed because the dog was sleeping on the bed now.
That's a funny story. I hope, yeah, the dog didn't suffocate you or, when you were.
There, there were no long-term negative effects for me, except
Uh,
I didn't have as much room as I used to.
right. I guess it's a small cost of doing business.
Right. Yes.
Um, so yeah, so how do we cope with all this? I mean, that we are. Oh, and by the way, I was going to say, I can already hear that someone listening to this video who might want to gaslight me or you or invalidate the message by saying, you just keep making excuses. You just keep complaining about things instead of just pulling up your bootstraps, instead of just trying to make something of yourself. You have to always find the problems with the world, right? Like what, you know, that's what the gaslighters would say, right?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
uh,
And
they
and
turn it into a shaming exercise, and instead of acknowledging all the truth that we just shared. Uh, and so it's a way of shutting people up, right?
right, absolutely. And so here's one of my responses. There's the Stoics largely replaced the Cynics in ancient Greece, and there's modern Stoicism as well. So in it, and the modern version of Stoicism is rooted in the ancient Stoicism from ancient Greece in the past. Okay. And there's a two-word motto for modern Stoicism. The two words are amor and fati. Amor, as in the root word of amorous. And so that's what it means. It means love. Fati, Fati. Amor fati means to love one's fate. And it's an order. It's an order. It's not a request.
Mm.
So I must love my fate. And twice a day, every day, at 10:10 a.m. and 4:10 p.m., my phone tells me amor fati and
Mm.
reminds me that I must love my fate, which for the most part has been great. I recognize that this is sometimes difficult, even for people who look and act like me. I'm Caucasian, heterosexual, and male. And there are many privileges come to me simply because of these features over which I have no control. And so I still occasionally quote Roddy Piper from the 1988 film They Live. Life's a bitch and she's in heat again. Yes, sometimes things don't go my way.
Mhm. Mhm.
And loving my fate can be difficult, even for somebody who's been playing this game for a relatively long time. I'm about to have my 16th birthday on February 29th of this year.
16th.
Right. Because February 29th only
Oh,
comes along every 4 years.
when you left service, active service. Is that what you mean?
No, no, no. February 29th
Oh,
only comes along every 4 years.
okay. Gotcha.
So I will have lived 64 years at the end of February, but I will only be having my 16th birthday.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Huh.
So
So when you
when
say
when when my ex used to tell me to act my age, I would point out to her that I'm only 12. What do you expect?
when you say loving, or when the philosopher says loving your fate, can you just expand on that with that?
Yes. Yes. There's a lot of good things that happen to me simply because of the time and place I was born. I had no control over those. I have no control over my genetics, right? That comes from my mother and father. I
Hmm.
have no control over the many things that have happened to me or for me over the course of my life. I don't have any, and yet those are the two factors that have essentially all the control over what I think and how I act. My personal history and my genetics. That's the whole story. And
Mm-hmm.
and yet I'm a Caucasian, heterosexual male. I got everything going for me. There's no way I would have been a professor had I not been a Caucasian heterosexual male. Those are the people who get hired into those positions. There's no way I would be able to survive today had I not been able to secure that position a long time ago and generate the money that I've saved and that allows me to create the videos I create now and have
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
interviews that I'm involved in now,
Mhm.
which are
Mhm.
many, right? So people turn to me for information, and because of the place and time that I was born, I have all this privilege that has been thrown at me.
Right.
So
Okay.
I admit that my life is way better than 99% of the people on the planet.
Right. Okay.
Certainly people of color, certainly women, they have a much harder life than I do. Almost all of them.
Yeah. And people who struggle with mental health.
Absolutely.
That's yeah, a very significant challenge that is hard to appreciate unless experienced. Um, so yeah, I mean, but putting things in perspective, I think is what you're saying, largely with the loving your fate, right? That is, I guess a lot of good things can come to us because of just how we landed in this world. There can be significant challenges as well, but I guess it's important to, I mean, one of the exercises is to put things in perspective, right? And kind of go, it's not as bad as I might seem or as what I might have thought.
Right. Right. And perspective is huge. Friedrich Nietzsche said a couple of things. One, he wrote, everything matters, nothing's important.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And depending upon how you interpret what matters and what's important, everything can be important, even though nothing matters. Nothing, 99.9% of the things that I do or that happen to me have no bearing on anybody else's life. None. Zero.
Mhm. Yeah.
So
Although
nothing matters.
we have a profound tendency to think we are the center of things,
Exactly.
which I think is another cultural remnant. It's there. If you want to look it up, it's a subject. It's called everyday narcissism. It's not narcissism as a diagnosis. It's entirely different. It's similar but different. From Nancy Van Dyken. She wrote a great book on it. And anyways, we grow up with these myths about how, we're responsible for other people's emotions. They're responsible for ours, and kind of like the world revolves around us. And
Right.
like we have control over things that we don't, right?
Right. Right.
And
And, and
so,
and this is where the two-word motto of modern Stoicism comes to mind again, amor fati. And it's an
mhm,
order. I must love my fate. I must.
mhm.
I don't have any control over almost anything that happens to me or with me or about me. Almost nothing. It's all genes and personal history.
Yeah, and it reminds me of that book from Byron Katie called Loving What Is.
Mhm.
Basically, I think is what you're saying.
Yes, right,
And like if you can just and radically accept reality like that, you can function better. But it's not an easy place to get to if you're used to being if you've raised and conditioned in this context, which is always dragging us away from reality, right?
right. Another line from Nietzsche comes to mind. And those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music.
Nice. Yeah.
It's all about what's going on in here, right? And whether I hear the music, whether I appreciate the freshly fallen snow today, or whether it irritates me because that's just one more day I've got to shovel snow. That's up to me,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So I
That's
mean,
that's
it's important to have the short list of ways of coping, right? That you hopefully when you're listening to the videos, you can whatever sounds sort of delicious to you as a way of coping to try and adopt that, so that you can live in this place which is has its nastiness and has its end point at some point.
right.
Yeah.
Probably the best known, while we're talking about Stoicism and modern Stoicism, probably the best known Stoic was Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And he famously wrote Meditations, a series of private notes to himself. He never intended for those notes to be published. And fortunately, They were published in the 16th century, and now there are more than a dozen English translations of meditations, including relatively recent versions published by major publishing companies. And I would recommend Meditations to Anybody by Marcus Aurelius
Hmm.
because they were intended as notes to himself. They were really orders to himself on how to pursue a decent life without disrupting other people within your society. So he he's just amazingly one of the most thoughtful people to have ever occupied this planet.
Yeah, I think I'm going to review those. Those are probably freely available, right?
Oh yeah,
Online.
a lot of them
Yeah.
you can find online,
Mm.
and much of the meditations is available online, and you can find a copy of the book at one of these, second generation publishing houses, probably for $4 or $5.
Right. Marcus
And
Aurelius.
Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus is with a C. Aurelius is spelled a little unusual. It's Aurelius. And he was the emperor of Rome during the last 2 decades of his life. He only lived to be um, not even 59 years old, just short of 59 years old. And in the last 2 decades, he was the emperor of Rome. And it's pretty interesting because I refer to him sometimes as the Jimmy Carter of his time. Jimmy Carter foresaw the decline of American empire, just as Marcus Aurelius foresaw the decline of the Roman Empire. And he had to act accordingly in ways that would be beneficial to the people in the empire without trying to sustain or expand the empire.
Hmm.
And
One of the better leaders then.
yes, absolutely. And, there's a reason Jimmy Carter only lasted one term.
Right. Or JFK, if he was, I thought he seemed like a good guy, but
Oh, yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
maybe.
Uh, Pretty much every day, I am reminded to say that every president in my lifetime has been the worst president in my lifetime. And we started with JFK.
Okay.
And of course, he was assassinated when I was 3 years old, so I don't have much of a memory of his time in office.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've only seen whatever's in documentaries or videos and but yeah, interesting history for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
And it's just been all downhill from
From
John
there.
Fitzgerald Kennedy to today. It's just
Yeah.
gets worse and worse.
From the invention of the Federal Reserve onwards. It's kind of like yeah, that's in the 50s, right? Onwards.
No,
Um,
no, no. That was the
no,
early 1900s.
early 1900s. Oh, okay.
And I
I
did
thought
a
it wasn't
video.
official.
I, oh yeah, the Federal Reserve became the U.S. bank that controlled the money supply in either the late 19 teens or the early 1920s. I made a
Okay.
video about this a couple or 3 weeks ago, and I can't remember all the details.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was just thinking ever since we've been laced with debt, right? Or where you're compelled to go into debt to participate in the system. And the whole idea is just to keep increasing the debt into infinity,
Right,
right?
right.
Like, so
Well, people point out all the time that every dollar printed is a dollar in debt, right? And if
mhm.
that's the case, I must have a lot of dollars because I'm seriously in debt.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the destruction comes from because people are always they're trying to survive in a debt-based system. Someone has to pay. And
Right.
I think it's Earth, really.
Absolutely.
And us humans, we pay too.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
And the future. The future always pays
someone's
for
got
the
to
act.
pay. Someone's got to pay.
Absolutely.
Eventually.
And so the greatest generation, right, pushed it on to the baby boomers pushed it on to the millennials trying to push it on to somebody else. It's just the way it's always been, as nearly as I can tell.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess we should wrap it up, and I'll just tell people about my course once more.
Excellent.
So yeah, if you want to learn more about how to manage one of the most challenging mental health conditions of all, borderline personality disorder, and maybe one of the least talked about, You can reference my material at freebpdcourse.com. And even if you don't suffer with mental health, I guess I would encourage you to learn about it because there's probably people in your life who do. And if you want to have a better experience with them, you need to understand them instead of falsely judge them. And that's all I'll say about that.
That's great. Those are great words.
Thanks.
And I look forward to another chat next week now that we're back on track and we've escaped from the holidays.
Sounds good,
So,
man.
all right. Talk later.
Talk to you later.